So it's just great to have you here, and what we know will be a most interesting program, a part of Palm Harbor and North Pinellas history that many people may not know or remember at this time. I'm just delighted you're here. Before we get started, I want to welcome our president, Bob Fortner, and give him an opportunity to chat with you and just share some news of the museum. So, Bob, anything that you'd like to share with us?
Welcome, everyone. And again, thanks, Ed, for participating in this and all the research that you've done. Any of you who haven't been to the museum recently, we definitely invite you to come by. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 10 to 2, we're open. We have a couple wonderful new exhibits, plus the existing exhibits, which are also very fantastic. When people come to the museum, two things I hear is that I've driven by there so many times and I've never stopped in. And the other thing I hear is, wow, we just never realized what a treasure we have here right in the middle of Palm Harbor and how much history is packed in to Hartley Home, which is also the Palm Harbor Museum. So we do present these programs on a donation basis. We do appreciate all of you who can and do contribute to the museum, because that is how we are able to afford to keep these programs coming to you. We are definitely a volunteer organization, and we do not receive government funding except for a few grants here and there. So we really rely on our donations and our memberships for our annual budget. And Erhan is our treasurer here. He's looking on, and he can certainly agree to that. He's been our treasurer for a number of years and seen us at some very low lows and not too many high highs. So thank all of you who are willing to contribute for this. And Joy, we want to thank you again for all you do for Meet Me at the Museum. You really kept us going through the pandemic with some just fantastic programs. We're delighted that they are getting up on YouTube now, so that we have that history of our Meet Me at the Museums available to the public. So that's all I have for now, and I'm going to turn it back over to you and Ed.
This is our YouTube page. So if you're inspired, Palm Harbor Museum, we also have a separate page for oral histories. That's notable individuals who are part of our Palm Harbor heritage, a whole channel of interviews and videos of those individuals. But on this page, various programs from our Meet Me at the Museums. So you can find that on YouTube and on our website. Always visit Meet Me at the Museum. If you're not on our mailing list, you can become a subscriber, and you can also see various newsletters. And as Bob said, it is so beneficial to us to have members and donations. They help us a great deal carry these programs forward. Enough for that promo, and let me take this moment now to take us forward into this program, A Profile in Courage, looking at Frank Weaner. And it is being presented to us by Ed Marks. Ed Marks is the president of Temple Ahavat Shalom in Palm Harbor. He says he's had the most fascinating life imaginable. He started out in broadcasting, was a news photographer. He said he imagined a career on the air, but was told he had a face for radio. So he went to that side of the industry, attended law school in his native Cincinnati, practiced there for 46 years in litigation and in estate planning with individuals, small businesses, and nonprofit corporations. He was active in the Jewish community in Cincinnati, served several terms on the board of his temple there, and with Jewish Family Service as one of the leaders in an effort that led to the merger of 25 Jewish cemeteries into a single organization. Chairman of the board of the Levitt Institute for International Development for about 15 years, has taught a full-year course on the rule of law and the adversary system of justice in Ukraine and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. He's now helping with resettlement efforts in Ukraine and Ukrainians who have been displaced. But we are so fortunate to have him as part of our Palm Harbor community, where he has been a long time on the board and with the temple at Ahavat Shalom in Palm Harbor, Shortly after moving to Pinellas County, first as a snowbird, then a permanent resident, beginning in 2009, he became active at the Temple and now serves as its president. He's also on the board of Top Jewish Foundation and has a real interest and a love of the human aspect of history. Ed, I am delighted that you are presenting this program for us and very much looking forward to what you're going to share with us about Frank. So welcome to the program. And when you speak, you should show up. I have you on speaker, so you should show up, but I'm going to pin you to the screen as well.
Good evening, everyone. I should introduce the evening by paying honor to the dozens of people who were injured and killed last weekend around our country by the hatred that seems to have captured a lot of us. I'm tempted to turn this talk into a sermon or into a political rant expressing my own outrage at those with whom I don't agree. I've stuck a sock in that part of my mouth, and I hope that by the end of this talk, A, you will have learned something about Frank Weaner and the Ku Klux Klan in Pinellas, and B, that you won't know from my words which political group I claim as mine. When I began preparing for this talk, I knew almost nothing about Frank Weaner. I knew that, like me, he was Jewish. I knew he had a reputation for generosity, that he was the largest single donor to the campaign that paid for the original Temple Ahavat Shalom building, and to the second financial campaign that added the sanctuary building. I knew that somehow he'd persuaded Ku Klux Klan leaders that they didn't really want to keep their Florida state headquarters in Palm Harbor. And then I learned some contradictions. One person said he was kind and gentle. Another friend said he was one of the toughest, hardest dealing businessmen he'd ever known. Everyone I spoke with seemed to say that as well as they knew him, they didn't really know that much about it. Indeed, Frank's name alone was a contradiction. From his own book, an autobiography called One Against Many, I found that some of his ancestors bore the last name Weiner, which translates from German into man from Vienna. Frank's own father and brother spelled their last name Weiner. Depending on the place such a name came from, it might be pronounced Weiner or Weiner, or as my former law partner, whose roots were in Lithuania, pronounced it, Weiner. Although the book makes no mention of the reason for these various spellings, I suspect that it had something to do with the custom of some Jews to change their names, either with modest variations or with completely new names, in order to make the name easier to pronounce, or to make the family fit in with the general population and not sound quite so Jewish. After all, for the first time in the history of the world, in the American experience, Jews could live where they wanted, work at any job, run for political office, and simply become part of the community. And a lot of Jews wanted to melt into the general society, but I digress. The real message here is that for whatever reason, Frank seems to have changed the spelling of his name to Weaner. I don't know why. Frank's family originated in Spain. Despite the expulsion of Jews from Spain in the Inquisition of 1492 and the great expulsions of the 17th century, the family stayed in Spain. Religiously, many of them formally converted to Catholicism, but continued to practice Judaism in secret. Such people were known as Marranos. If they'd been caught with any Jewish artifacts, or if they'd been discovered, well, in a Jewish service of any sort, the consequences would have been severe. That was the way of the Spanish Catholic hierarchy toward the Marranos. The secret Jews would suffer expulsion and confiscation of all their property if they were lucky, or torture and death if they weren't. Indeed, there's a lengthy story of Frank's ancestor, Don Manuel, Aguiar, who was officially charged with being a secret Jew. He was given a chance to convert publicly and to denounce his Jewish roots, but he refused. As a result, he was sentenced to be burned alive. On the appointed day, he and several other infidels were marched through the streets toward the stakes at which they were to be burned. But a former servant sidled up to him in the crowd and somehow managed to evade capture. The two of them ran for 2 hours. Ultimately, they reached the seaport and escaped by a ship. I just thought that was interesting, almost as interesting as the next generation, in which a son did convert and become a high muckety-muck in the Catholic Church, but then converted back to Judaism. The family story is long and intricate, but to move our story along, one of Don Manuel's great-granddaughters married a man by the name of Weiner, with a W-I-E. I'm sorry, that's Weiner, or maybe Weiner, whose youngest son, Leopold, was Frank's father. The family moved a lot: Chicago, New York, Newark, Detroit, back to New York, back to Detroit. While a student reporter for the University of Detroit newspaper, the campus newspaper, Frank had his first contact with the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan made the campus a Saturday night gathering place, finally building up the nerve to burn crosses on campus, and Frank Weaner was there to report on it. So here was this Jewish boy studying at a Jesuit university and discovering that a group that was filled with hatred for Catholics and Jews was making this their Saturday night hangout. It confused him, but fortunately no serious damage was done. Frank completed his college career and got a job with the Detroit Daily. He then went to law school, but quit when he was promoted from the rewrite desk at the newspaper to full reporter. Unfortunately, shortly, the newspaper went out of business. That didn't seem to bother Frank. He and a cousin headed off to New York City, where he got a job with the Daily Mirror. Then it was back to Chicago, where Frank fell in love twice. Once with the lovely Helen Samuels, and once with the lure of Hollywood, California. Shortly after Helen and Frank eloped, they climbed into a questionable old car and headed for the West Coast, where Frank was sure he could find a job writing for the movies and make a big name for himself. Well, no success there, I'm afraid, and it was back to Chicago and then to New York and Miami, to Madison, Wisconsin, back to Chicago. And in 1939, he ended up again in New York, where he left journalism supposedly for good in favor of a job as publicity director for the only U.S. World's Fair ever to fail. For a short time, he was in the liquor business, even owning a retail liquor store, and after the war, a beer shampoo company. Ultimately, he and Helen ended up in Miami, where they settled down to raise their daughter, as well as Frank's brother's son. Frank looked around for opportunities and invested his entire savings, and then borrowed as much as he could to buy a 5,600-acre patch of totally undeveloped scrubland up the coast, just across the Intercoastal Canal from a spit of land called Cape Canaveral. Aha, fortune was finally turning in his direction. Shortly after the Cape was designated as the U.S. Space Center, Frank sold off 500 acres to another developer, paid off all the debt, and began the slow process of building homes and businesses there. He became very successful financially. Although he had always wanted to own land, he soon grew bored with the tedium of building homes and making money. Well, that he never grew tired of. But he bought into a new for him venture, a candied fruit making company called Paradise Fruit in Plant City. That was the kind of challenge that he loved. And before long, it went public and grew dramatically. Frank was a man of principle and desegregated Paradise at a time when that wasn't popular. He eliminated separate water fountains, restrooms, and other facilities for his employees. Almost immediately, angry signs started appearing, which he traced back to some of his workers who weren't happy about the place being desegregated. And he summarily fired them as soon as he discovered who they were. This single act set a new tone in Florida and branded him as a social leader during a time of immense social change. A quick word about dates. Much of my information about Mr. Weaner comes from his autobiography. The chapters in this book are often arranged by subject rather than by date. And surprisingly for a newsman, he seldom dated any of the events about which he wrote in the book. Thus, if I seem to be a little inconsistent in some respects, it's likely a result of my inability to figure out just when certain things happened. But the relevance of this period of Frank's life is that it was during his time as a real estate developer and his time growing a small fruit packing business into a pretty doggone big employer that he met a lot of bankers, and he found a new interest. The family still lived in Miami, even though the businesses were located near Cape Canaveral and Plant City. And the roads back then, remember, were not very good. In 1965, Frank was invited to join the board of one of the banks that he had used to borrow money, and then a second one. He learned a good deal about that industry, and I guess he liked what he learned because sometime in the mid-1960s, Paradise Fruit Company purchased controlling interest in Capital National Bank in Tampa. Frank became chairman of the board. Over the next few years, he turned this tiny little community bank into a highly successful financial institution, often by lending money to borrowers who had been rejected by other banks. Indeed, it joined the list of America's 2,000 largest banks. By the time Paradise Fruits sold that bank in 1972, it had grown from a $3.5 million value to about $55 million. Well, with Capital National's growth, Frank Weaner's stature in the community also grew. He wasn't always respected for his ideas, though. For example, he viewed Tampa as a bit of a backward place, with little in the way of arts and culture, and he wanted to change this. The city fathers were quite content to leave it as it was. Ultimately, they formed a Tampa Arts Council, but omitted Weaner from its membership. He was just too radical. And that was something about which he wrote with some bitterness. He claimed that because he bucked the powers that be, he was banned from certain prestigious establishments. But even bucking the powers, he was very effective in raising the general community's awareness of the arts and in persuading wealthy people of the importance of supporting the arts. He twisted many a well-clothed arm for really healthy dollars to build museums, orchestras, a little opera company, and other charitable ventures. And he put his money where his mouth was. Frank and Helen became known as two of the most generous people in the region, and the Weaner philanthropy was very broad-based. In the 1970s, a group of Reformed Jews who lived in the northern part of Pinellas County decided that it was important to create a congregation for themselves up north, in part so that their children could learn about their religion with other kids that weren't strangers. Remember, the closest Reformed temple was way down a 2-lane US 19 in Clearwater. The other kids all went to secular school down there instead of Palm Harbor, where these families were from. Temple Ahavat Shalom was formed, meeting first in a motel, then in a converted restaurant. Finally, it was time to build their own facility, and Frank Weaner once again stepped to the plate with his checkbook. He was the single largest donor to the original campaign that built the first building, and several years later to expand the facilities on the campus to what it is now. It's on Curlew Road. It still looks modern and new. The religious school meets in the Helen and Frank Weaner wing of the building. But here's one of the most fascinating parts of Frank Weaner's life. When Temple Ahavat Shalom went looking for property, the orange grove they decided to purchase was only about 2.5 miles from the former Florida headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. The very notion of a Jewish congregation rising in the shadow of the KKK was a potential deal breaker. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about this period of Mr. Weaner's life, the episode for which he's often best recalled. First, I suspect there are some people listening who aren't really familiar with the Klan, so let's do a little history. During Reconstruction after the Civil War, the Klan emerged as a group of vigilantes opposed to voting rights for freed slaves. They used targeted violence and intimidation to, as the saying went, keep the N-words in their place. Klansmen adopted costumes usually consisting of white robes, tall conical hats, and masks to hide their identities. And they traveled in groups, sometimes very large groups, to be as intimidating as possible. The original Klan was largely forced underground in the 1870s, the late 1870s, by federal officials. A second iteration of the Klan emerged in 1915 following the release of the movie The Birth of the Nation. Instead of being merely anti-Black, this Klan also hated Catholics and Jews. And this period was marked by mass parades and cross burnings. The members were largely fundamentalist Christians, and the Klan was financed by initiation fees and profits from the sale of robes. They were strongly in favor of prohibition and stronger public education, but of course, their only form of education was what was favored. This Klan movement declined in the late 1920s. Then in about 1950 came the third wave of the Klan. This time groups, sometimes called klaxons, were more localized. They developed their own language, sort of. Their primary focus was to oppose expansion of civil rights. And in addition to intimidation, this was an era of arson, lynching, and other forms of violence and murder. There were and still are competing KKK groups, and they don't always agree on goals or methods, but they do hold some notions in common. For a while, the Klans operated a political party with the goal of running candidates for president and vice president. They went so far as to articulate a full party platform. Some of the planks of that platform bear note: the recognition that America was founded as a white nation, which of course it wasn't. Put America first in all foreign matters. The first and only concern of our government should be for the citizens of the United States. Abolish all affirmative action programs that discriminate against white people. Abolish all anti-gun laws and encourage every adult to own a weapon. Actively promote love and appreciation of our unique European, that is white, culture. All foreign aid should be stopped immediately. We support a national law against the practice of homosexuality. We support the voluntary repatriation of everyone not satisfied with living under white Christian rule back to the native lands of, quote, their people. Well, clearly, some of these may seem rational, a couple of them, and normal today for some people, but the underlying support for these positions, the goals which the Klan pursued are A, that America was created to be a white country, B, that it's a Protestant Christian nation, C, that it should isolate itself from the rest of the world and reject all foreign contact, and D, that anyone not pursuing these goals should get out. As I mentioned before, there were a number of separate Klan groups, and while they generally mouthed the same principles, they didn't always agree. One of these groups, United Klans of America, published its own set of precepts, which you can see on the screen. If you'd like copies of any of these, by the way, let me know in the chat or through the museum, and I'll email them to you. Frank Weaner had experienced the KKK at the University of Detroit, as I said, and he carried memories of Klansmen attacking the chapel there in their white robes and their masks. These memories were ugly ones to him. On September 5, 1977, as he was driving to work at the New Palm State Bank building, this was a bank that he purchased later, was on US 19 at the corner of Nebraska Avenue. And that building is still there, by the way. As he drove north past Tampa Road, somewhere around where the Einstein Bagel store sits today, he encountered a big sign which read KKK headquarters. Well, being who he was, he jammed on his brakes, turned into the drive, and found a white frame home, seemingly deserted in the early morning moment. He was stunned. He went on to work and had his banking folks do some digging. He discovered that David Duke, the imperial wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan down in Louisiana, had decided to place a Florida state headquarters in Palm Harbor and had enlisted a local Klansman by the name of Jack Gregory. Gregory had gotten free use of the land from the owner, who was a sympathizer and was also angry with the government over a zoning issue. Frank's inquiries led to a barrage of anonymous telephone threats against the Weaner family, but no actual violence. Then Frank learned that anti-Semitic graffiti had been painted on the under construction Temple Ahavat Shalom on Curlew Road. That made him angry. Frank had worked in business for years. I spoke last week with his grandson, Randy Gordon, who's on the call tonight. Randy worked with his grandfather and still is president of Paradise Fruit Company. He confirmed what I had surmised from everything I've read. Frank Weaner was a fast learner when it came to analyzing a business or a situation. After reading everything he could find about the Klan, Frank concluded that it lived on lies, and that the best way to fight lies is with the truth. For example, the Klan was actively promoting a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This ugly book has been around for centuries, a lot longer than the Klan has. It purports to be the minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders who were supposed to have been planning world domination. It is the purest form of anti-Semitism and has been labeled that way for centuries since it first appeared. But it still rears its head every once in a while. Now think of it. Consider reality. First, there is no hierarchy in the Jewish world. We have no pope. We have no central authority of any sort. Each congregation is completely independent. Rabbis are not assigned to congregations, but are hired much as a business might hire a chief financial officer. Second, Jews, this disorganized group of people with who knows how many separate movements, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Humanist, and on and on and on. People who can seldom agree on what time to start services. Supposedly the Jews, who number 1.5% of the population of the United States or less, and 0.2% of the world population, that's 0.002. Supposedly we Jews are plotting to dominate the world. Well, that's only the premise of the protocols. The details are even more preposterous. Every scholarly study ever made of the book brands it as pure pap. The Klan had printed numerous other papers and booklets as well. Well, once he had read everything, Frank Weaner contacted churches in the area and persuaded the Chamber of Commerce to pass a resolution opposing all hate groups. Churches sermonized against hate groups. And then, alone and with no organization behind him, Frank decided to do something. He called Grand Dragon Jack Gregory to ask about the rally that the Klan had planned for November 10th and 11th, 1978. Gregory confirmed the dates, confirmed that David Duke was set to speak there. And then Frank asked the big question, will the rally be open to the public? Gregory answered that all white people would be welcome to attend, but blacks were not. For emphasis, he stated that many of the Klan hosts would be armed because, as he put it, we're constantly threatened with bodily injury. Mr. Weaner then politely challenged the truth of some of the Klan materials he had before him. Gregory danced around a bit and ended the conversation by simply hanging up the phone. Well, that was in September. The rally was planned for November. A few days later, on Sunday, September 27th, shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning, a group of hooded people showed up on the grounds of Palm State Bank. They dug a hole, inserted the base of a 4-foot cross wrapped in oily rags, lit it on fire, and departed. Someone called the fire department to report the fire. They extinguished it, but apparently nobody bothered to call the police, or the police ignored it, as the cross was still there on Monday morning when bankers came to work. The threats continued. Some were blatant and ugly, others were more subtle, but all of them were anonymous. Things like this note, and notes that said, the Klan is watching you, or we know where you live. The media got wind of things, and they called David Duke for comment. He confirmed the upcoming rally and said the Klan expected thousands of people to attend. As we've already seen, Frank Weaner was a direct, let's deal with things kind of person. In response to these threats, he phoned Jack Gregory, Grand Dragon Jack Gregory, and said, let's have a face-to-face meeting. That meeting took place over lunch at all places, this tickles me to death, at Sambo's. Gregory denied having anything to do with the cross burning. He had denied having anything to do with the threats. He admitted, however, there were some militant people in the Klan, and he said he threw them out anytime he discovered them. Yeah, sure. On the other hand, the conversation was calm and straightforward. When Weaner asked if Gregory would reconsider his position to be represented with facts that proved that Klan materials were inaccurate, the Grand Dragon said he'd change his position, quote, if your facts are true, close quote. Frank specifically addressed the lies about Jews set forth in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Gregory answered, we aren't against Jews, we're against Zionists, which of course is completely contrary to the Klan claims that they seek racial, religious, and ethnic purity. Gregory gave Weaner a card, which states in part, it was a membership card, said there are thousands of organizations working for the interests of blacks, but how many groups stand up for the cultural values and ideals of the white majority? Gregory expressed his opinion that the late Pope John Paul I was actually Jewish, apparently an explanation of the Klan's anti-Catholic positions. Lunch was over. The conversation ended. Everyone prepared for the big rally, including David Duke, who again estimated to journalists that attendance would be thousands of interested Americans. The Klan showed its expertise in garnering publicity by flooding the media with a lot of advanced materials. Former journalist Frank Weaner decided to fight fire with fire, and he bombarded the media with facts. So it became a battle of the publicists. November 10th of 1978, dusk. On US 19, north of Tampa Road, a horse draped in white in front of a sign reading KKK rally tonight. Sitting on the horse, a man in a white robe with a pointed hat with a shotgun aimed at the sky. Around him, More white-robed Klansmen, seeming to guard the many tables with stacks of printed materials. In front of them, a large cross with oil-soaked rags wrapped around the wood. Across the road, a tall Jewish man with thinning hair, dressed in a suit and tie. With him, a Methodist minister and a number of other people. When they thought the time was right, they crossed the road, walked past the sentry on the horse, and asked another Klansman, "Where can we find Jack Gregory?" They were directed ahead and found the most decorated of all the Klansmen. Frank approached. "Gregory?" he asked. The Klan leader removed his hood and said, "Hi, Frank." So here they were, the Jew, the Methodist minister, the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Florida, in the middle of a massive crowd of about 200 people. Not the thousands they'd predicted, but about 200 to 250, some in robes, some in Levi's ordinary clothing, some seemingly merely onlookers. Frank asked to meet David Duke. Gregory departed and returned with Duke. After the introductions, and Duke said he had heard of Frank, Weaner said he'd gathered and reviewed some of the materials that were displayed and that they were lies. He asked Duke for proof. Imagine this, alone, this Jewish man is calling David Duke a liar and asking for proof of the truth of any of these materials. Well, friends, a confrontation of this sort, not about hate, but about truth versus lies. David Duke wasn't expecting that. In front of print and broadcast reporters and in front of the cameras, Frank Weaner asked David Duke for proof. And then he began presenting items to Duke, such as a series of congressional reports, which pretty devastatingly disproved some of the Klan claims. He left Duke speechless. Jack Gregory, the Grand Dragon, leaned over and whispered in his ear something like, "Frank, some of these folks are getting ready to be ugly. I think you'd better leave." Having accomplished his purposes before the media and the Klan, Frank Weaner and his small group of gutsy cohorts said goodbye and took their leave. He had faced the enemy in the enemy's den and he had survived. But he wasn't done. Over the coming days and weeks, he wrote letters to the editor, wrote an op-ed titled "What is an American?" and spoke to a lot of civic groups. And then late in November, remember the rally was November 10th and 11th, late that month, he received a phone call from Grand Dragon Jack Gregory. Gregory said, "You were right. I've resigned from the Ku Klux Klan." Gregory told him that he had repeated some of the questions Frank had asked with Duke and got no real answers. Gregory finally concluded that David Duke was indeed a fraud, and most of the Klan positions were lies. Gregory then invited Frank Weaner to his home. Think of that. The Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan inviting this Jewish man, his declared enemy, for a powwow. He delivered to Frank a large batch of materials that proved in his mind that he had been hoodwinked and that the Klan was a fraud. With the Grand Dragon Emeritus's approval, Frank arranged for television interviews at which Gregory spelled out all this falseness in the organization he had formerly led. And then Jack Gregory and Frank Weaner went to Miami, where Gregory turned over all his files and his recollections to the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League. The Klan was effectively dead in Florida. Its former headquarters suffered a number of fires of questionable origin. But that's not the end of the story of Frank Weaner. Although I haven't been able to document the full story, I do know that another Pinellas pioneer, Charles Rutenberg, in 1980, purchased the land on which the KKK Center sat. I've heard that he was a friend of Frank's, and I suspect he learned about this vacant land from Frank. He built shopping centers on it. I heard that when he bought it, he said, those people will never be welcome back here. Well, that's not the end of the story of Frank Weaner either. I hate to mention it, but I wouldn't be even a minimally adequate biographer if I didn't. In addition to his work at Paradise Fruit, Frank continued in the banking business. He was at Palm State Bank, essentially an executive, and did little bank work on a day-to-day basis. I gather, however, that in his work with civic groups and nonprofits, he often put in a plug for Palm State Bank. Anyone would. And it continued to prosper and attract new depositors. It grew like crazy. But not all the depositors, the customers were little old ladies or mom and pop businesses in the now thriving community of Palm Harbor. Indeed, banks need larger depositors and borrowers to survive. And some of those coming to Palm State were larger than large. They dealt in cash, vast amounts of cash in small bills, origin unknown. The result of some of these transactions, the bank and 3 of its officers, including Frank Weaner, were charged by federal authorities with a number of crimes related to money laundering. Frank declared his innocence. The case went to trial before a jury. Insofar as Frank was concerned, he was found not guilty of the felony charges, but he was convicted of 2 misdemeanors, far less serious. The conviction was confirmed on appeal. This episode was a bitter pill for him personally. He said he had not played any role in the scheme, and he never accepted that as bank chairman, he could be liable for what others had done, or perhaps for not keeping a closer eye on what others were doing. There was a law which said that any cash transaction with a bank involving $10,000 or more had to be reported unless it was with an established customer. And that was what the dispute was about. Well, Frank's autobiography, One Against Many, seems to be his personal effort at vindication. I understand that. After all, if we weigh that one conflict with the legal system against all the good Frank Weaner did in the world, against the jobs he created, the desegregation that he initiated, the battles he fought, the good he created for his communities, the evil he exposed to the light of truth, I think we'd have to conclude that when Frank Weaner died at age 89 in 1997, he was warmly welcomed in heaven, if indeed St. Peter does a balancing assessment. I suspect that St. Peter took a look at the Palm Harbor Library, which named a teenage reading room for Frank. And the Temple Ahavat Shalom religious school wing still bears their name as well. Those honors alone should have guaranteed a spot in heaven, wherever and whatever it may be. Thank you, Frank Weaner, for being part of our community. And thank you, my friends, for staying with me through this presentation. It's another piece of history in Palm Harbor.
Ed, this has just been amazing. And I knew it would be amazing, but even more so than I imagined.
Thank you.
Your research, and I knew you had told me you were reading the book. The book belongs to the Palm Harbor Museum. We're so grateful to you for disseminating it, for condensing it for us and giving us a sense of it. And I know you have additional individuals speaking, so I'm going to let you continue that before we open things to general questions. I know there are those who are going to offer comments before that.
Open to comments, questions, anything else. Probably can't answer the questions, but I'm willing to give it a try.
We would love to have your comments. Art Polin, a longtime resident of Palm Harbor, businessman here, and knew Frank and has told me that Frank inspired your coming to Palm Harbor yourself. Please share with us your comments.
Yeah, I don't have a camera on this computer here. In fact, for an old man to figure out how this thing worked just to get on, I figured that's an accomplishment.
Art, after we spoke this afternoon, I figured I'm still older than you are.
You're old enough to be my older brother, Ed. And by the way, I had told both of you, I apologize in advance, that I had another meeting that I was going to have to pull off of this early. And I found it so fascinating that I got off for just a couple of minutes, called the other people and said, I'll get back to you in a couple hours. So I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
He was a great man. I knew him. I was his physician and his friend, so I had a little bit different relationship with him. But I will personally forever be grateful for him, for his support and for his encouragement when I was doubting the fact that I might be able to make it here in Palm Harbor. So he'll always have a special place in my heart.
Art, tell us about what you've done in Palm Harbor and your relationship to Frank and how he convinced you to come here.
I was a 27-year-old resident at Tampa General who had been offered a very cushy salary job with a very prominent group of internists there. For reasons I don't remember, I had found out about this little community called Palm Harbor. There were no doctors there. So I figured I'm either the luckiest guy in the world or the dumbest guy in the world for not having figured out why there's nobody here practicing medicine. And I came here with a lot of trepidation. One of my first stops was to meet with Frank at his office. And as I told Ed this afternoon, I still remember him sitting behind what I thought was the Resolute desk from the White House, smoking his cigar. And he said, "What's your concern, young man?" And I said, "I just feel like I'm about to make a big mistake." And he said to me, "Son," he says, "you're going to make a lot of mistakes in your life, but coming here to Palm Harbor isn't going to be one of them." The Jewish community in this town would not be what it is today were it not for him. I mean, there were a lot of people, who were involved in bringing Ahavat Shalom out of the ground, but without him, and not only his money, but his leadership, it just wouldn't have happened.
Thank you, Art.
Randy, as his grandson, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do have a few thoughts and observations. And Art, I certainly remember you a bit, and for sure your name. I can tell you, as Ed said, even though we've sold the company, it still does exist, and I am the president and CEO of Paradise. But we've in the process of selling it, but because of COVID situation, it's just taken a long time. But I am the third generation, which my grandfather started, then my father and myself. And Art, I just wanted to tell you that desk that you're talking about that you marveled at was my desk for the last couple of decades, because I've never seen a desk like that in my life. And it was beautiful, and it was like a presidential desk. But I do want to make a couple observations. I learned a great deal from my grandfather. He was a very different sort of guy. He knew what I would say a moderate amount of facts about a lot of things, and wasn't always a lot into detail unless it was financial matters. I think I shared with Ed that during our weekly board meetings, and he really, in his banking years, he never really worked at Paradise much when I was there, but he would come every week for a board meeting, and he could analyze some figures in a company we might be looking at in his head in 15 minutes, what our CPAs took several days to do, and come back with pretty much the same information. He just had a knack for that and a knack for business. I do want to thank Ed for the terrific job you did. I kind of reread The Hate Virus, and especially the section about the Ku Klux Klan when you were speaking, and you're right on. I found it amazing more so amazing that he met with that he met with Jack Gregory in Sambo's, who we knew was armed at the time, and who knew what my grandfather was getting into there. I find that a little bit more gutsy than taking on David Dukes, because all the television cameras were there in a way. And I can remember those days. I was 18 years old, and I also worked a short period of time as a teller in that bank in Palm Harbor. But I remember the FBI coming to our home in South Tampa because my mother, Frank's daughter, was petrified of this situation, of course. And so there was a little bit of protection for us from the FBI. I will close and say that in some respects, the story that Ed told, unfortunately, hasn't changed a whole lot in almost 50 years. And we won't get political, as Ed said there, but the hate still exists, and we certainly, as Jews, need to be vigilant, because this is how these grassroots things start. And but I'm very proud of my grandfather, always have been, taught me a lot in my life, and I miss him and my grandmother dearly.
I wish I'd known it.
Art, you wanted to add a quick comment?
Yeah, just a quick comment that, your comments made me think of this. That man was fearless. And, the things that you've talked about tonight, I think attest to that. But I also know, and I don't know how much you were familiar with your grandfather's health, but he was having some problems toward the end of his life, probably the biggest one being his eyesight. And there was nothing that stopped that man. I mean, nothing.
I'm gonna tell you a quick story about that, if I may.
Please.
So I believe I told Ed about this. Frank had macular degeneration.
Right, that's right.
And even though there probably isn't even a cure for that today, you know more than I do, Art, but back then there wasn't much to do at all. And the two centers that were well known for macular degeneration was in Miami and Boston. And I accompanied him to both places to try to get some help for him. But the funny story, and what I always have cherished and told friends of mine, is while in Boston and sitting in a very nice hotel after a dinner, after we sought some medical help for him, I'll never forget that here's my elderly grandfather that can't see very well, teaching me at a Ritz-Carlton overlooking the Boston Commons how to drink cognac like a gentleman. And he gave me those lessons. And it's just something that sticks in my mind, one of the many lessons I have from him.
With a cigar.
With a cigar, yes.
Yes, always. And I do remember when I would visit him at his home in Tampa, that he in every room there was a gigantic magnifying glass.
Yeah, he used to read on a device.
He was a
He used to read on a device that enlarged the letters. I don't know what it was called. It was a machine, but that because he did like to read, and losing his eyesight to read was a terrible issue for him.
Yes, it was.
Tom, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that between Wall Springs and Crystal Beach, there's a community called Indian Bluff Island where we live. And part of it, there's a vacant lot that's still there that fronts on 19A. And there was a huge KKK sign made out of concrete blocks. It was about 30 feet long and 20 feet tall, and it had KKK on it. And a woman who lived in Indian Bluff Island named Gracie Lee Merrill organized some high school kids, and they painted over the KKK. This was about 60 years ago when she moved here. And she likes to tell this story, and she's very proud of it. And there were, Art may know them, there were a couple of doctors who lived on Indian Bluff Island. starting in like 1962. One of them was a dermatologist who had an office in, I'm just blanking on his name, who had an office in Clearwater. But this sign, it was a very big sign, and originally the sign had been part of some kind of a trailer park or something, and then it just sat there with KKK, and Greasy got it painted over.
You know, if you're talking about anti-Semitism here, there's a story I forgot altogether that Frank helped me with. One of the things that attracted me, as I said, I was leaving Tampa. I had a 1-year-old baby at the time, and leaving a salary job to come here and hang a shingle and put my feet on my desk and wait for the first patient to show up. And one of the things that got me over here was there was a nursing facility north of here that was up and coming and asked me to be their medical director, which would have given me an instant form of income. And I hadn't been here for more than a week before I got a call from them telling me that they were going to have to let me go. And why? Because, and I'm quoting, "Good Christian people deserve a good Christian doctor. Welcome to Palm Harbor." And I was devastated. And Frank he assured me that things are going to get better, and don't let it get you down. But I mean, the point is that anti-Semitism is pervasive, and it's not unique to Palm Harbor. But even in this little town, we got more than our share of it.
I just want to comment again to thank you for being such a wonderful host, and thank you, Frank, but also to just remind the folks that are here that our little Palm Harbor Museum offers quite a service, I believe, to the community, and even to a larger audience than we might think, by being able to find folks like Ed and stories like Frank's and be able to let people know about them and let people know about the history of the African-American participation in North Pinellas and many other stories like this that are so very important. I was very interested one time. I was at the museum overhearing someone talking to one of our docents about the African-American exhibit that we have. And he said, "Well, can't we just get past all this?" And I said to him, I said, "Well, it's a history museum. You don't get past history.
Yes.
You learn from it and move into the future." But that's why one of my sayings has always been that to preserve the past and protect the future, those of us who care must be present. And I think those of you who've been online and have commented tonight, and certainly Ed, you're one of those people that are a living presence that can help us preserve the past and protect the future as we appreciate the shoulders that we stand on. So it's a great honor to be able to be part of the Palm Harbor Historic Society and part of the Palm Harbor Museum. And again, I'm just very amazed by not only Meet Me at the Museum, but also our oral histories that have so much to teach us. Again, not just about the past, but also about the present, as Ed mentioned, and also the future, what we want it to be like for our children and grandchildren. So I thank all of you who do care enough to be present.
This program certainly does tie into the African American exhibit at the Palm Harbor Museum. Gives us a sense of members of our community who have made a difference, how diverse it is, and the history of Palm Harbor.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen the museum, please come by.
And Frank is featured there.
Yes, he is. And the temple.
He is featured there, yes.
Come by the museum at the corner of Curlew and Belcher Road. It is open Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 10 to 2. And it is a real gem in Palm Harbor. And many people speak of, as Bob said, we didn't know there was this kind of history. And the exhibits, of course, are always changing, but we have some exhibits in there right now that are permanent exhibits and always being added to. So come by, contact us at palmharbormuseum@outlook.com. And Ed, you mentioned the people were welcome to contact you.
Sure, that's fine.
We do have group tours. All you have to do is let us know you're interested in bringing a group, and we'll arrange for a docent to lead you through. And our docents lead you through on a regular basis when you come by anyway. There are always docents there during the hours that we're open. So you can walk through and really learn something unique about Palm Harbor that you probably didn't know.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
A superlative program. You've given us
Double
all
thumbs up.
so much history, and we all know Frank better.